Long before computers, satellites, and digital surveillance, the world was already fighting wars over information. Empires rose and fell not only because of armies and weapons, but because of secrets: who knew what, who believed what, and who could control the flow of information. In the 18th century, intelligence was slow, fragile, and dangerous to carry, yet it was just as valuable as gold. Messages traveled by horse, ship, and foot, and a single intercepted letter could change the fate of an entire campaign. Espionage was not a modern invention. It was a fundamental part of power. European empires had long mastered the art of spying. Britain, France, and Spain all maintained intelligence networks that stretched across continents. Diplomats doubled as spies. Merchants gathered rumors. Clergy passed messages under the cover of religion. Codes and ciphers were used to protect sensitive communications, and counterintelligence catching spies was considered just as important as battlefield victories. In this world, information was scarce, slow, and lethal. If you were caught carrying secret messages, execution was often immediate. The American colonies existed within this system of global espionage. Though they were geographically distant from Europe, they were deeply connected to imperial intelligence networks. British officials monitored colonial newspapers, tracked political leaders, and reported signs of unrest back to London. At the same time, colonial elites learned how power truly worked. They saw that empires ruled not only by force, but by narrative, by convincing people that authority was legitimate and resistance was futile. As tensions grew between Britain and the colonies, information became increasingly weaponized. The British tried to control what colonists read, heard, and believed. Colonial leaders, meanwhile, realized that open rebellion would fail unless they could shape public opinion and hide their true intentions. This was the moment when information warfare moved from the margins to the center of the conflict. Unlike modern wars, there was no clear distinction between civilians and combatants. Printers, writers, shopkeepers, and sailors all became part of the intelligence ecosystem. A tavern conversation could be intelligence. A newspaper article could be propaganda. A rumor could weaken morale or spark rebellion. This blurred battlefield forced the colonies to innovate because they could not win by traditional means alone. The stage was set for a new kind of war, one where secrecy mattered more than strength, deception mattered more than numbers, and the ability to manipulate information could determine the future of an entire continent. When the American Revolution began, the colonies faced an impossible challenge. They were confronting the most powerful empire on Earth with limited resources, fragmented leadership, and an untrained military. Victory through conventional warfare was unlikely. To survive, the colonies needed an edge, and they found it in espionage. George Washington understood this better than anyone. Though history often remembers him as a general, Washington was also a spy master. He believed that intelligence could compensate for military weakness, and he invested heavily in secret operations. Under his leadership, America developed one of its first organized intelligence systems. One of the most famous examples was the Culper Spy Ring. Operating in British-occupied New York, the Culper Ring used techniques that closely resemble modern hacking strategies. They relied on aliases to hide identities, used numerical codes to encrypt messages, and employed invisible ink to conceal sensitive information. Messages were hidden in everyday objects, delivered through unsuspecting couriers, and decoded only by those with the proper keys. What made these spies effective was not technology, but psychology. They exploited trust, routine, and human error. British officers assumed that civilians posed no threat. Merchants and farmers were ignored. Women, in particular, were underestimated, which allowed them to pass messages unnoticed. These assumptions became vulnerabilities, much like weak passwords or unpatched systems today. Espionage also relied on misinformation. False intelligence was deliberately fed to the British to confuse troop movements and inflate colonial strength. Fake documents were planted. Rumors were spread in taverns and marketplaces. The goal was not just to gather information, but to control what the enemy believed. This is why the term hacker fits surprisingly well. These early American spies didn't destroy systems, they infiltrated them. They didn't attack directly, they manipulated from within. They understood that the most secure system could be compromised if you understood human behavior well enough. Without these intelligence networks, the revolution would likely have failed. Espionage allowed the colonies to anticipate British plans, avoid disasters, and strike when the odds were favorable. It turned weakness into advantage and secrecy into survival. For the American colonies, espionage was not optional, it was existential. Every mistake carried enormous consequences. A lost battle could be recovered from, but a compromised intelligence network could collapse the entire rebellion. This forced American leaders to think strategically about secrecy, deception, and information control. One of the most important lessons learned during the revolution was that perception mattered as much as reality. The colonies needed to appear stronger, more united, and more legitimate than they actually were. This illusion was carefully constructed through selective information sharing and propaganda. British commanders often overestimated colonial capabilities because of exaggerated reports and planted misinformation. Meanwhile, colonial setbacks were downplayed or hidden entirely. This manipulation of perception kept the rebellion alive long enough to gain foreign support, particularly from France. Espionage also extended beyond military intelligence. Political intelligence was just as critical. Colonial leaders monitored loyalists, tracked dissent, and identified potential traitors. At the same time, British intelligence tried to infiltrate revolutionary circles, bribe officials, and sow division. The revolution became a constant contest of counterintelligence. This period also marked the early use of psychological operations. Fear, hope, and anger were deliberately amplified to mobilize the population. British authority was portrayed as corrupt and tyrannical, while the revolution was framed as a moral and inevitable cause. These narratives were not accidental, they were engineered. In modern terms, this was asymmetric warfare. The colonies couldn't overpower Britain, so they outmaneuvered it. They attacked weaknesses rather than strengths, relied on stealth rather than force, and treated information as a strategic asset. These principles would later become foundational to modern intelligence and cyber warfare doctrines. Winning the war required more than military victories, it required winning minds. Information warfare became a central strategy for undermining British authority and rallying support both at home and abroad. Pamphlets, newspapers, and public speeches were the social media of the 18th century. Writers like Thomas Paine used emotionally charged language to simplify complex political ideas and make rebellion feel personal and urgent. These messages spread rapidly and shaped how ordinary people understood the conflict. The colonies also targeted international audiences. France in particular was closely watching the conflict. Colonial diplomats carefully curated the image of the revolution as a noble struggle for liberty rather than a chaotic rebellion. Intelligence leaks and battlefield narratives were selectively shared to attract sympathy and support. At the same time, the British struggled to control the narrative. Delays in communication meant that London often operated on outdated information. By the time official responses arrived, public opinion in the colonies had already shifted. This lag created an information imbalance that the colonies exploited relentlessly. This phase of the war demonstrated a critical truth: whoever controls the story controls the conflict. The American Revolution succeeded not just because of battles won, but because of narratives believed. When independence was finally secured, the lessons of espionage were not forgotten. The United States emerged from the revolution with a deep understanding of intelligence as a tool of power. Though the young nation publicly emphasized liberty and transparency, it quietly preserved the machinery of secrecy that had ensured its survival. Over time, these early practices evolved into formal intelligence institutions. As technology advanced, so did methods of surveillance, encryption, and information control. What began with invisible ink eventually led to signals intelligence, satellite monitoring, and cyber operations. This legacy explains much about the modern world. America did not stumble into information warfare, it was born from it. And as America grew into a global power, other nations learned the same lesson the colonies once did. When you cannot match strength with strength, you target information. The conflicts of today are digital echoes of the past. Different tools, same logic. Different speed, same stakes. The battlefield has changed, but the war over information never ended.